Welcome to another exciting episode of NIDS Knowledge, a weekly show of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, where we advance peace, promote stability, and help you to think deterrence. This episode is part of our regular Deterrence Down Under series, focused on Australia and our deterrence challenges in the Indo-Pacific region. Good day from Canberra. We hope you enjoy the show. Hey there. Welcome to Deterrence Down Under. I'm your host, Carl Rhodes.
Hey, I'm Christine Leah.
Hey, today's topic, we're talking about deterrence from the air domain, the challenges Australia faces, and ideas to improve that deterrence, and maybe even our air domain force structure and ways of thinking about how to use the air domain. So today we're really delighted to have Chris McInnes as our guest. He's executive director at the Air Power Institute. He's both an air power and a national security expert. He's got 25 years of experience in military, government, and industry. And he's also a frequent commentator and speaker at many defense seminars here in Australia. I've seen him around at many of the various places here. So we'll start with a little bit of deterrence news. Because we're talking air power today, I put our deterrence news also focused on pieces from the Royal Australian Air Force. So first is Exercise Bushido Guardian has wrapped up at Misawa Air Base in Japan. That brought together F-35A Lightnings from Australia's 3 Squadron, the Japan Air Self-Defense Force, and the United States Air Force. The trilateral drills sharpen 5th-generation air combat tactics and deepen interoperability among the 3 forces. Beyond the flying, the exercise signals how Australia, Japan, and the U.S. are quietly building the practical and interoperable military muscle. So in my opinion, this triad is much more exciting than what everyone wants to talk about, which is the Quad. Japan, Australia, and the U.S. have real defense cooperation taking place, less handshakes at leadership meetings, more jets in the air, more jet fuel being burned. Second piece of news, the Royal Australian Air Force has sent one of its P-8A Poseidon patrol aircraft north to Kadena Air Base. That's in Japan as part of Operation Argos. So that's the ongoing mission that's enforcing UN sanctions against North Korea. That aircraft's job is going to keep watch over the seas, spotting, tracking, and recording all those sneaky ship-to-ship transfers of banned goods where Pyongyang is trying to dodge those international restrictions. It's not as glamorous as Top Gun Maverick, but it's just as important. Each flight adds to Australia's commitment to international agreements and the rules-based order. And speaking of that, Operation Argos, let's not forget that these missions aren't without danger. So last year, operations saw one of those gray zone moments that reminds us quickly how a routine air patrol can turn risky. Chinese J-10 fighter dropped flares right in front of an Australian Navy helicopter. Thankfully, no one was injured, but it was a reckless, unprofessional act that was emblematic of China's ongoing pattern of military bullying across the region. These are the kind of encounters that make deterrence a living, breathing challenge, not just an abstract idea. So with that, we'll turn back to today's focus, which is air power and our guest, Chris McInnes. So Chris, Australia's strategy leans really heavily on denial. And here in Australia, we're a maritime nation. I mean, even the anthem tells us we're girt by sea. And the question is pretty obvious from that. How can air power really support that strategy? And what's the role that it plays in helping keep our maritime environment secure?
Okay, well, thanks, Carl, and good morning to you, and good morning, Christine. It's really great to be here. We are girt by sea, but we're blanketed by air. Everything is covered by air: sea, land, littoral, whatever you want to look at. We are covered by air. I like to talk about Australia as being an archipelago within a continent, because if you look at a population density map of Australia, it looks quite similar to the Japanese archipelago, separated by enormous oceans of land and sea. And the thing that connects the people that live on those islands is largely aviation and air power. I think it's really important. We are a maritime nation. Maritime isn't just sea. Maritime is a combination of all of the domains interacting in and around the world's seaways. So we depend on air lines of communication in a similar fashion to the way we depend on sea lines of communication. You'll often hear the 99% of trade by bulk or by volume comes by sea. But if you look at it by value, then you get 22% of imports come by air. So there's a really perishable, time-sensitive things like pharmaceuticals, microchips, spare parts, but most importantly, people. 100 million people move through Australian airports in 2024. So there's a lot of people moving through Australian airports. And that's not just tourism, it's vital services. Our fly-in, fly-out miners depend on aviation. The Royal Flying Doctors Service provides medical coverage across the continent using aviation. And our tourism is third or fourth largest export. So the economy depends upon aviation, as does our way of life. In terms of the maritime strategy and the strategy of denial, the way I think about air power is that it provides time, space, and options. If you have strong air power, then you have time, space, and an ability to control and dictate events in a way that you don't if you don't have air power. That has two effects. One, it makes the job of the Army and the Navy easier, far easier. And it gives them different options and different ways to operate, but it also provides the government with distinct options in and of itself. So air power is not just an enabler or a supporter of the joint force, it is part of the joint force, and it can go and do things that are different to what air and land and naval forces can do on their own. And finally, I would, as you can see from Operation Argos and the deployment of the P8, there is no sea control and there are no sea lines of communication without air power. Over the top, transport, reconnaissance, strike and combat are all fundamental to sea control. And that's been the case since at least the 10th of December 1941 when the Prince of Wales and the Repulse were sunk in the South China Sea and Australia's Singapore strategy fell apart in the space of an hour or so.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good review of why air power is so important. I mean, air power provides some unique capabilities, and what's the air power view of what are the unique capabilities it brings to the domain, and as compared to naval forces.
So the way I think about it in two main ways. The first is over not through, which is a phrase that Paula Thornhill coined in the US, and that was essentially to capture the way that air power provided new ways to solve old problems, and that came out of the First World War and the mass casualties that came in the First World War from using large land armies. And out of that was a realization, or certainly a reaction in democratic nations, that they never ever wanted to do that again. They never wanted to send another generation of young men to die. And so air power, particularly in countries like Britain and America, that really drove the development of air power, because every soldier and their families were voters now, and you couldn't just send them all to die. So air power is a way to solve old problems in new ways, in a way that is far less casualty intense than than surface forces tend to be. That is really important for a country like Australia with a relatively small population and an enormous area to cover. The other phrase that I like to use is reach out and touch somebody, which comes from the Noiseworks song Touch from 1988. But I first came across it in an F111 promotional video, I think in the early 90s. And the point that's making there is that air power allows you to reach out and touch whatever you need to be influencing across an enormous area. And when you're a country like Australia, sitting in our quarter of the globe, that is a real challenge for us to be able to influence events across an enormous territory with a limited resource base, and to do so quickly and over and again, and all from sovereign territory. There's no need for us to be forward deploying and trying to base ourselves in other people's territory to do that. I think that's.
I was going to say, I think that's one of the real challenges that Australia has as compared to, say, the UK. Just the vast amount of area of responsibility, I'll put it that way. The land part is big, but there's also a huge maritime component and islands that are isolated from the mainland here in Australia that others don't think about typically.
Yeah, and that so people often think about that in terms of purely range, that it's a long way from one place to another. But I think there's a separate coverage challenge, which is, yes, it is a long way to get from one place to another. But if you have problems in two different places, those two different places will be an awfully long way apart. So in order to address two problems at once, or two problems in quick succession, it's very hard to get between the two places quickly. So it's being able to do things over and over again, day after day after day, as well as just the range. And the third point I make is just cost effectiveness. Aircraft are expensive, airports and air bases are expensive, but if you look at their cost per effect and what they generate in terms of operational return, I think you get a tremendous return on investment for quite a modest investment. Particularly, there are not many people involved comparatively.
Yeah, Chris, I've seen you speak at Williams Foundation about that, putting together some of the numbers for various types of operations and showing how air power can be more effective, and reminds me of some old RAND analysis I did back in the day, of comparing air forces to land forces and air forces to naval forces, trying to provide the same kind of capability or bombs on target. So,
yep.
In terms of looking at, got a lot of listeners in the U.S. and around the world who come from outside Australia. How does air power thought here diverge from how, say, the U.S. or U.K. or NATO or others might think about air power? What are our unique challenges here, and how do we think differently?
So I think the unique challenges haven't changed. Relatively small population, enormous territory to cover. Those are the two key ones. How do we think differently? I would suggest maybe we don't think as differently as we need to, or certainly haven't in the past. Up until the late 80s, we still used the Royal Air Force Air Power Manual, 100%, including the nuclear element. There was a chief of the Air Force back then called Ray Fennell who described the RAAF as intellectual beachcombers, because we just sort of wandered along and picked up other people's ideas and borrowed them. And we still do that a little bit today. I certainly know in my Air Force career, I spent a lot of time with people saying they'd gone over to the US and they'd seen something and they brought it back here and, okay, let's do this. And I'd say, okay, do you understand that you saw the tip of the iceberg and it's much harder than they made it look because you only saw a small sliver of it. But I think so that was part of it. We didn't really generate our own ideas. The other part has been a lot of our operations have been plug and play. So we've showed up and plugged forces into a larger coalition force led invariably by the Brits or the Americans. And the RAAF became exceptionally good at that. It was exceptionally good at that, very reliable, very good at doing those things. It happened during the Second World War, and since we didn't, out of that experience, gain a whole lot of time conducting independent operations. So that made things really challenging for us, and it means that we don't have that institutional legacy of independent operations. So the Canadians, with their forces in Bomber Command during the Second World War, they formed their own Canadian bomber group. Australia didn't do that. Our forces, our people were spread all through the country, spread all through the Royal Air Force Bomber Command. So we didn't gain that higher command experience, and the higher command experience that we had in Australia during the Second World War was, I think, Alan Stevens, who was my old honours supervisor. He described it as an institutional disaster because it was a disaster for the RAAF and Australian Air Power because we never took the lead on our operations. We always let someone else tell us what to do. And so I think that institutional legacy and that history means that we don't have that strong sense of independent and self-reliant operations in Australia right now. I think that is one of the key challenges for Australian Air Power and the RAAF in particular.
Yeah. And, with the focus of the challenges, especially for Australia, turning to the Indo-Pacific rather than the Middle East, it's a different kind of operations. Even if you're plugging and playing, right? It's a different plug and play in maritime operations in a maritime dominated environment as compared to a land focused environment where the distances might be smaller or there's more bases that you can consider.
Yeah, so that's part of it. I think the other part of it is the amount of discretion that we have over the types and character of operations that we conduct. So as things get closer to your homeland, those operations tend to get more important and less discretionary. Your risk profiles might change. So you don't get to necessarily control the tempo at which you operate. You may have to respond to the tempo that some other people are setting.
Chris, that's absolutely fascinating. I hadn't thought of that so much. And like my brain kind of went to a previous episode we did where we talked a little bit about Australian strategic culture. And like that's a really interesting point that we haven't had to kind of lead or kind of be that innovative in our thinking about the nature and the role of air power so much. I'm on that note, like I'm really interested as Australia is kind of seeking to have more clout, military clout in the region. Um, yes, the US still has the lead, kind of, but we are having to play more of a role. We are having to think much more seriously about deterrence and the role of hard military power. I'm keen. We had a guest on the show. He wrote an op-ed a few weeks ago saying that the US should give Australia its old B-2 fleet, which I thought was interesting. And then I was having lunch with a colleague, a retired air commodore, and I was saying, like, what do you think of this? He's like, well, if we weren't getting AUKUS, then that could make sense. But given the cost of maintaining a B-2 fleet, it doesn't really make sense. I'm interested, do you think perhaps Australia has more, to what extent maybe Australia has done more thinking about maritime power as opposed to air power? Or do you think that's kind of in the same vein that we haven't had to lead very much in our thinking overall?
So I think it's kind of back to one of the first points I made, that maritime is not just sea power. And I think in the discussion that has happened in Australia around bomber options, for some reason, a lot of it has been, it's either Pillar 1 of AUKUS submarines or it's bombers. I don't understand why those two things have to be a binary choice. You can have one or the other. I understand there's a lot of money involved in both, but for me they are complementary capabilities, and I think that's a long-range bomber force has been central to Australia's strategy since the Second World War up until 2010 when the F-111s left service. I think that's for all the reasons that I've talked about in terms of air power being particularly useful. Bombers don't replace submarines. Submarines don't replace bombers. They are two different and distinct capabilities. I think the submarines offer a lot of great capabilities. I don't think they offer the same strike capability that bombers offer, but that's okay. They do other things, and so I think we need to have a different discussion that isn't one versus the other. I do think there's a couple of things to sort of put around the do we need bombers conversation. The first is that our current strike capability is pretty strong and proven. There tends to be this view that air-to-air refueling tankers will be shot down the instant they leave the runway. Physics still applies and geography still applies. In order for that to happen, someone has to get close to you. So, if we fly aircraft across the Pacific, so this idea that we can't use tankers to extend fighters or combat aircraft to long range, I don't understand, because we do it all the time. It is routine business. In fact, I think that's possibly why people don't understand it, is because sophisticated air forces do air-to-air refueling like going to the shops to get milk. It is completely routine business, and I think that is the case now. So I think our current strike capability is very, very strong, and it's proven and it's potent. I think we could add to the depth of that with more tankers, more crews, and more weapons. Those would be initial things that we could potentially do that may be less expensive than the new bombers. Look, of the B2s, B1s, or B21s, if it was me, I would not be pulling my wallet out for anything other than the B21, because I don't need to take on someone else's clapped out, retired old vintage aircraft, which would be enormously expensive, both in dollars and manpower to run. and sustain. As aircraft get older, they get more and more expensive to run, and both of those fleets are old. They have been flown an awful lot. But beyond that, I think the B1 and the B2 are bombers. The B21 is not a bomber. It's a multi-role platform capable of doing an awful lot of things that would be enormously valuable to Australia. Reconnaissance, battle management, command and control, all of these things. It's also set up to evolve the way that warfare is going with autonomous collaborative platforms and those kinds of things. So,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's also the question of whether the B-21 is available for sale at this point in time, right?
Yeah.
I mean, other countries need some B-21s that are building them. The United States has a massive bomber shortfall now. And the one you didn't mention, Chris, is the B-52. I mean, I've got a kind of a soft spot for the B-52. And the United States Air Force is going to fly that for a long time. So you never know.
But, I think, you raise a valid point that the problem we have is mass at long range. That does not necessarily need to be a bomber aircraft. It could be some other form of large platform that can carry lots of things and release them at long ranges. So, I think we need to think carefully about what it is that we need.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, it's the start with the why, as we talked about in our last episode. So, and I think the other challenge with like bombers, penetrating bombers like the B-2, you look at that strike on Fordo and the package they put together against an Iranian air defense system that was already pretty degraded. We're talking 125 U.S. aircraft participated in that mission to get some B-2s through and put bombs on target. Now, of course, you always want to put together the best force package for the job, but putting that mass together to support, the B-2 doesn't go in alone and unafraid. It needs help. So that there's that part of it too, that if Australia wanted to have a penetrating bomber, it needs to figure out all the pieces that go with it as part of that package. And it's not just a B-2 alone. I think that takes us to kind of another point, which is there's other emerging forms of air power here that have come over in the past 10 years. And, all the way from drones that look like something you can buy at Costco, the DJI Mavic 3, to cheap cruise missiles. That's a different form of air power that is threatening traditional air power at times, striking aircraft at air bases. How is Australia thinking about this, and how should we think about it?
So I think I'll use Peter Layton. He's a friend of mine and a doctor at Griffith. He's talked about the concept of heterogeneous air power. So having a lot of different forms of air power, and I think that's where it's heading. You'll have your large manned aircraft or large crewed or uncrewed aircraft. They don't necessarily need crews, and then you'll have your small things. But I think it's important to remember that one doesn't replace the other. I think there's been some really good work done on the relative effectiveness of sending thousands of drones at targets and 10% or fewer of them actually getting through. That rapidly becomes not very cost effective because you're spending an awful lot of money on a lot of drones and you're not having much of an effect. So I think for Australia, given our geography, and geography still does matter, we need a mix of big things to do the big things for reach and for concentrated firepower in terms of strike. But I think there's a case to be made that we also need small things for mass, just in terms of numbers. And it's that finding that mix is the real challenge, I think. But I don't agree with we need to buy drones just because we need to buy drones. Well, again, back to the point we discussed before: why and what for? What are we trying to achieve? So I think the strikes on Iran Midnight Hammer showed that sometimes you still need big aircraft to carry big bombs to strike targets that are deeply buried or very hard. Small drones and small warheads simply won't have an effect on a warship that you necessarily want to put on the bottom. So sometimes you're going to need things that go bang in a really big way, and you can only deliver those with large aircraft.
Yeah. And those who want to replace all the large aircraft with small drones, you can't just release them from Darwin and expect them to go
No,
someplace
yeah.
tactically interesting, right?
Yeah, the headwinds over the ocean are going to make it quite challenging for some of these drones to go forwards rather than backwards, I think.
Yeah, exactly. There's that whole delivery challenge for sure. Christine, any other questions before we hear more about the Air Power Institute?
No. I'm really interested to hear more about the Air Power Institute, Chris, and what big topics are you kind of working on, researching? What are the big questions for you?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so the Air Power Institute, we're still relatively new. My colleague John Conway and I set it up in 2024. And our main focus and our continued focus has been on that cost effectiveness side of the house, and really making the case that air power is an incredibly cost effective way for Australia to do business. And that's looking more broadly beyond the defence budget, the acquisition budget, and it's looking more at, well, what's the actual return that we get on air power and aviation, and what are the different ways that we can look at things. So I think, one of the really interesting things is Australia actually has a thriving aviation industry, and I think the Air Force is actually a relatively small part of Australia's total national air power, which is not the case if you look at sea power. Like the Navy is basically Australia's sea power. There's not much of a civil fleet to go with it. So it introduces a different paradigm for air power, and we are focused on really drawing out what is the value that Australia gets from air power and aviation in terms of the nation and in terms of the Defence Force.
Fantastic. What a great discussion on air power today. Something that's close to my heart, something that I studied for 20 years back at RAND in the U.S., and a topic that's been really important for Australia going forward. So contributions are going to be critically important in the coming years and decades to help us achieve this strategy of denial. Many thanks to our guest, Chris McInnes, for joining us today, helping us tease out these issues. And I want to thank our listeners and encourage you to subscribe and review our podcast. It's going to help other people find us. And lastly, I wanted you to have a great day, and just remember to always think deterrence. Take care. A quick postscript to today's episode. Chris appeared in his individual capacity, yet he's also an ADF reservist. As a result, his remarks were reviewed by Defense before we could go live, and we agreed to some minor changes to the podcast as a result. Thank you for listening to NIDS Knowledge, Deterrence Down Under. This show is produced under the NIDS Podcasting Network, a division of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies. NIDS is a U.S.-based 501c3 organization dependent upon donations to provide this podcast and bring about awareness of the peacekeeping value of U.S. strength, alliances, and deterrence. You can catch all of our podcasts or provide feedback at thinkdeterrence.com. I thank our producer, Kimberly Charrington, our sponsors, and all the fantastic members of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies for making this podcast possible. Stay tuned next week for another exciting and informative NIDS Knowledge.
The NIDS Podcasting Network.